Hi, good afternoon. My name is Amy Wexler. I am the Associate Director for the Oregon Justice Resource Center. I'm so glad you can join us today. We are going to have an important conversation about youth justice in Oregon, and we've got some great folks on this panel who you're going to hear from. We just wanted to introduce you to some of the topics that we're doing as we're doing this series this week, Bending Toward Justice. And youth justice is an important issue always, but it's been really an active issue for us here in Oregon this year in particular. So I'm excited for you to hear about the work that we've been doing at OJRC. I do hope that at the end of this conversation, you might decide to support our work. And you can go to ojrc.info/donate and make a contribution if you're so moved. Also, you should follow us on our social media at OJR Center on Twitter and Instagram. And here we are, you've already found us on Facebook. So again, thank you for joining us, and you're going to learn more about our work as we go through this. I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves. I'll call on each of them in turn. So Dre, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself to the folks who are viewing today, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. My name is Andre Miller. I'm an activist and an advocate in the community, and my students or my children are working with the organization that they created called Students Against Oppression at Gresham High School. And just want to thank OJRC for creating this space. I think it is super important to be able to amplify the youth voices and work towards a community that they envision.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andre. Gabe Newland, please introduce yourself.
Hey, my name's Gabe, he, him pronouns. I am director and managing attorney of the Youth Justice Project. I actually am relatively new to OJRC in Oregon. I moved here earlier this year. Before that, I was a defense lawyer and civil rights lawyer in both New York and Louisiana.
Thank you, Gabe. Alice Londell.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alice Londell. I'm the Director of Communication for the Oregon Justice Resource Center. I use she, her pronouns. I've been with the organization about 6 years, and I work with all of our programs to help get the word out about our work and also to do public education outreach around the issues that we work on.
Thanks, Alice. And Trevor.
Thank you, Amy. Hello all, my name is Trevor Walraven. I am co-founder of the Youth Justice Project, administrative coordinator and outreach. I'm also a formerly incarcerated juvenile lifer, so I served nearly 18 years in 9 different facilities throughout the state of Oregon. And so have the lived experience end of things from the juvenile landscape in the system. Great to be here.
Thank you so much, Trevor. Where to begin? There's a wide range of issues, but I think what we're going to start with is talking to Dre about what he's seeing in Gresham. Unfortunately, a lot of people have heard of this term, the school to prison pipeline, and they're thinking about, how does that happen? And often there's school resource officers who are placed in our schools. And this is something that I think that the students in Gresham have been doing work around. And so I'd like to hear from Dre about the experiences that they're seeing down there in Gresham. And Gabe, I know that you came and spoke to those students too. So maybe after that you can weigh in as well.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. So my students started at Gresham High School this year after attending North Clackamas School District for about 5 years, where they encountered a lot of racism in the North Clackamas School District, where they were being called derogatory names. Students were standing on desks singing slave songs to them. And it was something that not just was encountering from students, but also staff and faculty played a role in it. So the history of my students have been, fighting against derogatory things in oppressive institutions for the last 5 years. We recently just moved to Gresham. We've been here for a year. My kids started at Gresham High School just this year. And when they started, they were seeing the school resource officer have been profiling a lot of the marginalized students of color by doing things such as Well, in 2019, there was an incident with a Black student, female student, where that officer actually spit in her face. In these are several different incidences, but spit in her face on one occasion, commented on her body parts on another occasion, and then there was an occasion where she had a child that actually attended the daycare at the school, and he tackled her while she was on her way to actually pick up her child. This was one encounter that happened in 2019 that led to students protesting against this police officer. The administration was actually aware of this situation. The officer remained in the school, which led to more things actually happening this year, because the year after that, they were on online school. So this year, there has been things with the officer actually patting down certain individuals without parents' consent, going to Spanish speaking families' houses and saying that they were going to arrest their students if they came back onto campus. There was also an incident at a football game where there was confrontation between a white student from Gresham High School and a confrontation between the Black players from Centennial High School. The officer stood in place and kind of like protected the white student and started walking out the students of color or the football players of color from Centennial High School. There were several other different occasions that have actually happened that made specifically women of color, Spanish speaking students of color feel that they were being profiled. So my daughter created an organization in the school called Students Against Oppression. They're on social media. They've been really big advocates for their peers. What we've come to find out is that administrators haven't been trusted by students to be able to go to administration and talk with them about their actual incidences. We've had conversations with the principal, the superintendent, and those conversations kind of played out in such a way where the principal was like, y'all have only been in this school district for 3 months, and I've been in this school district for 3 years, and y'all have heard more about these incidences happening than I have heard in my 3 years, which really shows that the administration aren't aren't trusted to be able to have the students go to them and talk to them about the actual incidences. So this Students Against Oppression organization is a group of students, about 15 of them, that get together. They advocate for their peers. They receive a lot of direct messages and emails from their peers talking to them about incidences that they've actually encountered with this school resource officer, with administration. The school resource officer was actually the top priority. That's not the only thing that they're actually fighting against in the school. Another thing is the vice principal told a Black female student that Breonna Taylor was actually murdered because she had drugs on her. So these are things that they're advocating for their peers. They participated in the school board meetings with providing testimony. They protested outside of the school board meetings as well. They've written emails to city council and elected officials to get the school resource officer out of the actual school. Just as of recently, probably a few weeks ago, the superintendent actually reassigned this school resource officer out of the school. But as we dug deeper, we came to find out that the school resource officer actually got promoted. So what they did is they took him out of the school, but they promoted him to a district level duties where he's actually doing some sort of training. We don't know what training, but to us, it seems like they're training other SROs or policies and stuff regarding safety around the school. So that's a concern for us. We've been participating in what the next SRO contract might be. We were at the public safety meeting out here in Gresham. We were the only Black family that participated in that discussion, and it's super important for us to be advocates for the people that are actually marginalized in our community, to talk about how these racist and oppressive policies that are put in place continue to profile us or over police us in our schools and in our communities. My daughter spoke up at that meeting about the SRO, but there was also a lot of conservative people that were snickering, laughing, saying that it was a setup, that we were there, kind of really demeaning our whole experience as Black people in our community, in the encounters that we come across when we're dealing with police officers. Another thing is my daughter goes to one of my daughters go to a middle school, and at that middle school they used to have different pods. So it was set up as like a A, B, C pod at Clear Creek Middle School, where those kids that were like in C pod were the ones that were the troubled students. So they would segregate them as good students, students that need help, behavioral help, and then students that pretty much, were the bad students. And that is pretty much things that led them down a path. And the research actually showed that the students that were in the C pod ended up having troubles going through their life later on, or ended up actually getting into trouble. So that is leading to the school to prison pipeline, as well as these encounters that these students were having at Gresham High School. Some of them would get into like regular fights. Fights happen at school, and also can be prevented with prevention work and intervention work. But a lot of these fights were getting referred to the justice system. So then they would face charges as youth and juveniles in the juvenile court system. One thing that we've also found out is that these concerns that was once coming to authority wasn't then getting forwarded to the chief of police, who then oversees this officer that is in the school. We had a conversation with Chief Goldberg just a couple of weeks ago, and Chief Goldberg actually said that they had no reports on this officer from the school. So everybody that was coming to the school district or the authority that was put in place at the school, those conversations would never then get forwarded to the police department that can then hold this officer accountable. I think that that's pretty much where we're at right now at Gresham High School.
It's a lot. Oh my goodness. So it sounds like, you guys are really starting this process that it should have been started as far back as 2019, if not further back than that, and you just don't know about it, where we're holding this school resource officer accountable for his actions. And it sounds like the Gresham School Board should be involved. The police department should be involved. And you're working on it, but it's a lot. So thank you so much for sharing all that. And I'm just sorry that your family is dealing with it. Gabe, I know that you went and spoke to these students. I don't know if you've got thoughts to weigh in on that with Dre and what his family and the others are going through in Gresham.
Yeah, thanks for sharing all that, Dre. And I think one theme that comes through is that the presence of police at Gresham High School and other schools is not making people feel safe. It's often the opposite. Some people have this idea that the police are there to keep the students safe, but in practice, what's happening is that the police at the schools are policing a certain segment of the student population instead of trying to protect them and help them. And so just to zoom out and sort of talk about the historical presence of police in schools, in 1975, only 1% of schools in our country had cops. And then by 2018, that number went up to 58%. And today there are 14 million students who are in schools with police officers, but no counselors, nurses, psychologists, or social workers. So, what are we doing to actually help young people feel safe and live healthy and secure lives? And why is it that instead of investing in teachers, making sure they have the funds and the support they need to help our students, we're putting people with guns who don't make them feel safe in a school. And I think this is sort of consistent with other things that we see at our work at the Youth Justice Project, of this kind of idea of child super predators and the criminalization of children. It starts in schools and having cops in schools, but then also we see it continue into other parts of our work where Oregon doesn't have any minimum age for prosecuting kids in juvenile court. Someone as young as 7 can end up facing charges. Very young kids, teenagers, can end up facing adult criminal charges, and then they can face very long prison sentences, even though they're kids. It's a common thread running through all of our work that we're doing, but we're very interested in trying to support the students in Gresham and other students around Oregon who are organizing to create police-free schools.
I think another thing that's important too is that these students are requesting that they get more mental health counselors and more counselors, just like you spoke on. Everybody's dealing with the pandemic right now, and the kids not being able to be in school and socializing for the last year and a half, and now just getting back into it. A lot of people are dealing with things in their community. They're dealing with things at home, where some of their parents might not have jobs, might be backed on rent. So everybody is dealing with stresses right now, and especially our children that actually need the support. So we need more counselors, and that's what these youth actually want, is the more counselors. And another thing too is we get a lot of backlash saying that we need to build relationships with these police officers. And I get this, some people might have great experiences with police officers, but just because some people have good experiences with police officers, I don't think that it should be minimized or detracted from that some people, especially people of color, do have bad experiences with police officers.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's going to be people who are watching this who would like to get involved, whether they're, in East County and Gresham, or whether they're anywhere else throughout the state. You said that your the student group is on social media. So it's Students Against Oppression, but how would people find them on social media if they wanted to follow them and help out and get involved?
Yeah, they're on the 3 major social media platforms: Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And they're really active on Twitter and Instagram. But if you look up Students Against Oppression, you'll be able to see them on social media, or you can email them at studentsagainstoppression@protonmail.com.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I do want to shift focus a little bit, and Gabe, I wanted to ask you, so we had some big changes in Oregon, and you mentioned, the fact that, there was not a minimum age for youth to be prosecuted. And I know that there was this automatic waiver that went where young people could be waived into adult courts. And a lot of that has to do with ballot measures. Would you just give us a little bit of a background and what happened in 2019 to change the way we treat youth in our justice system?
Yeah, so for many decades, starting with ballot measure 11 in the 90s, but also predating that, Oregon has been tolerating racist youth sentencing practices that are also completely divorced from the science of brain development. And you mentioned one of the things that was happening under the old law is that people who were charged with certain kinds of crimes, young teenagers were being automatically prosecuted in adult criminal court. And then once they got there, they were facing extremely long mandatory minimum prison sentences. In 2019, thanks in part to Trevor and many other people at OJRC who were doing this work before I got here, and many other people around the state, through Senate Bill 1008, a bipartisan supermajority of the state legislature rejected a lot of these old sentencing practices, and they started to bring Oregon in line with science of adolescent brain development and also constitutional limits on extremely long prison sentences for kids. And this was legislation that had support across the spectrum, from Democrats, from some Republicans. It had support from some prosecutors in the state, including the state attorney general, a lot of different crime victims, dozens of retired judges, and even the leader of the state prison system were all on board with creating these new changes to the system. And some of those changes are, now instead of automatic prosecution in adult criminal court for some of these serious criminal charges, people are entitled to a waiver hearing before they have to go to adult criminal court. And so a judge has to look at some evidence and decide whether it makes sense based on what we know about that person to send them to adult criminal court. And it also limits life in prison, life without parole prison sentences for kids. And so now people who are getting long prison sentences have an opportunity to get a second look at their sentence after they've served part of that sentence. And so we're not imposing the same kind of really long, harsh prison sentences on people that we once were. And we're still far from perfect, but these changes in 2019 were very significant. But notably, the legislature didn't extend a lot of these new improvements to the sentencing laws. They didn't extend them backwards to people who had already been sentenced under these old laws that we've now acknowledged this were wrong. So there are some people who were sentenced under these unscientific and racist sentencing laws who are still in prison and didn't get the benefit of that legislation in 2019.
Yeah. Well, before we turn to those folks, I have a question, and I don't know the answer to this, and maybe you don't either. So I'm sorry to spring something on you, but do we know, since that law went into effect, Senate Bill 1008, how many youth have been waived into adult court? So how successful has it been in keeping youth in the juvenile justice system versus being into an adult court system?
Correct me if I'm wrong on this, Trevor, but I believe that only one person has been waived, one teenager has been waived into adult criminal court since that legislation.
To the best of my knowledge, that is correct. I think it is worth delineating that one individual has gone through the waiver proceeding and been waived to adult court. There are other youth who accepted adult plea agreements that put them into adult court. So that's an important differentiation. But as far as actually being waived into adult court, I'm aware of one in the state.
Yep, that is an important differentiation. And it's unfortunate. It sounds like that district attorneys might be that's what they're offering them, are adult sentences, rather than taking into account their age and mental maturity when offering sentences during plea deals. So I don't, that I'm not sure if you'd agree with that, that's what's happening, but it sounds like that's what's happening.
Yeah, and just to chime in, like on that piece, there are some prosecutors around the country who have pledged to not prosecute kids in adult court ever. So the prosecutors in Los Angeles and San Francisco, for example, even though it's technically allowed by law, those prosecutors never prosecute kids in adult court. And meanwhile, in Oregon, even some prosecutors who are positioning themselves as more progressive are continuing to prosecute kids in adult court.
That is really unfortunate. So back to the thing that you had brought up just a few minutes ago. So I know that this year, Governor Kate Brown has decided to take a look at if those who were not included in the reforms of Senate Bill 1008. So those are mostly now adults who were sentenced as youth to long sentences, either life sentences sometimes, or the equivalent, maybe a 200-year sentence, which obviously would be a life sentence equivalent. What changes has Governor Brown talked about making this year? What is in motion for those left behind?
So the governor is using her clemency power, and for those who aren't familiar with that term, the governor, the same way that the president of the United States has the power to commute sentences and reduce people's prison sentences or even pardon them for crimes altogether, in the state of Oregon, the governor has that power for people who are convicted of state crimes. So she can She has the legal authority to reduce people's sentences for a lot of different reasons, and pretty much any reason she wants, or she could decide to pardon someone for a crime. And so in this particular instance with youth, she, recognizing that this new legislation passed in 2019, but it doesn't extend backwards, she's using her clemency power to give relief to a lot of people who were sentenced under the old laws. And so she's not making the law retroactive, but she's using her clemency power sort of to give kind of the practical benefits that people might have received under that law. She's extending that to them. So some people who are doing really long prison sentences that wouldn't have had an opportunity to go before the parole board for quite a long time are getting an opportunity to go before the parole board sooner than they might have. Other people who, under the new legislation, they're already past, they've already done half of their prison sentence, and if they had been sentenced under the new laws, they would be allowed to go back to the court and get something called a second look hearing to take another look at their sentence. And so the governor's kind of, in effect, giving them a chance to do something similar by telling her, she sort of invited people to submit these clemency applications to her to tell her about what their life was like before they committed their crime and what they've done since then, in asking her to consider their youth at the time of the offense as a reason that they maybe shouldn't be sentenced to such a long sentence.
All right, that was a great summary. Thank you, Gabe. And actually, I want to ask Trevor to weigh in, because Trevor, I know that you had mentioned already that you were sentenced when you were a juvenile, and that you have personally benefited, although now it's been a few years, from the governor granting clemency. So if you wouldn't mind just sharing briefly what you'd like to about your story and how the governor was able to benefit you and what you're doing.
Sure. Thanks. So I personally didn't benefit from the governor's clemency outside of my brother was given clemency by our current governor. But I went through the second look process, having been waived to adult court, and would be a very similar process to what an individual post 19 would benefit from halfway through their sentence if they were waived to adult court. So I went in at 14, served nearly 18 years in 9 different facilities throughout the state of Oregon. I benefited from the very different rehabilitative environment of our youth system, especially in comparison to our adult system. And I say rehabilitative, but it's habilitative. The idea of rehabilitation means that you're getting back to a place, and with young people that are underdeveloped and haven't fully formed, not only fully formed brains, but also just haven't fully developed their character. You're really talking about helping support an individual get to a place where they're kind of going to be for the foreseeable future. You're helping them get to a place of fully developed. And so I think in my experience, our youth system does a much better job about creating an environment that's supportive as opposed to our adult system. Resources are vastly different. But I was able to benefit from a lot of different programs that both Oregon Youth Authority and the Department of Corrections had available, and was able to get different degrees of higher education. Although I didn't formally get any kind of college degrees, I was able to benefit from a number of different classes and programs that were offered. And I had the good fortune to benefit from a second look and have a judge kind of reconsider the life in prison sentence that I received as a 14 years old, and get out after serving nearly 18. So I've been really fortunate to advocate out here, to do this work, to help support the passage of Senate Bill 1008 in 2019 with a lot of colleagues here in Oregon and national partners as well, who came and supported our efforts to get to a place where we are now. And then I'm able to continue to support this move to really provide hope to folks that we often think of as left behind by the passage of 1008 because it wasn't retroactive. So for those that have been fortunate enough to be invited by the governor's office or receive an act of clemency by the governor's office, that potentially reduces the amount of time that they're serving in prison, I think is, I'm super supportive of that. I'm grateful to see that hope that's been inspired by so many. The families of those who loved ones are incarcerated see a hope that they didn't see before. And also hope to see a level of healing that and a level of closure that may come from the result of individuals being able to step out of custody and be productive members of the community. Prisons, in theory, are there to keep society safe. If we have people, and I think we see this particularly with young people who go in at a young age and develop and find good morals and values and redevelop those things that maybe were instilled during their upbringing and they strayed from, as I did, or maybe weren't, come back to the community and be productive members of society. That's what we want. So super grateful to be a part of this, to see this move and this shift, and to see the hope that's been inspired in so many.
And Trevor, what year was it that you were released?
So I was initially released in February 3rd of 2017. Excuse me, 2016.
Okay. And
so I've been out about 6 years.
Okay. And so you had mentioned when you introduced yourself that you were one of the founders of the Youth Justice Project. When you were helping to launch the Youth Justice Project, what did you have in mind, and how do you see this growth as it became a part of OJRC? How do you see the impact of that?
Sure. So my vision has been one of a holistic system involved youth, and that holistic support really is fully encompassing. I think the hope is that we can get to a place where we're a resource kind of for anything and everything that's involved in system involved youth. So for me, there's particular interest around the transitions, transition from out of custody to in custody, the transition from a county level facility to an adult level facility, or excuse me, a county to a state, and then within youth systems to adult systems, and then transition out of any of those systems back into the community, wanting to see that transition as smooth and as successful as possible. Because I want safe communities, I think, no differently than anyone else that is in society. And so I know that there are hurdles and barriers to folks that are coming out of custody or transitioning from one place to another. And I want to see that happen in as smooth a possible way, so that, hopefully that individual is successful as well as the community around them sees that as a success. And so, whatever that looks like, I think at times there are folks who have been those harmed by an individual's actions that really have no idea of what the system has available and what hurdles and transitions look like, and have no idea of what might be available to help them through their harm. Being a resource for that, being a resource for families whose loved ones is incarcerated and not knowing how they can support them, how they can send something to read, or, just provide support, visit, all those kinds of things. Support for an individual that's navigating that themselves. There's oftentimes a traumatic experience being incarcerated. It's traumatic being moved from one place to another. It's traumatic to lose your freedom, right? And have an environment that is very structured and very delegated to you. And so helping people learn how to make those transitions successfully. And then again, the resources that are available out in the community and finding those resources, networking, peer mentorship, all of those pieces I feel like are part of that holistic approach that I like to see us take. And sometimes that means supporting litigation teams, defense work. Sometimes that means helping create some level of mediation. Support in any which way. That to me is what kind of it's the roots of the Youth Justice Project.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, and I would say that, whether we brought Alice on here today, it was because, there's been the way that media has framed all of this. And I'm sure, you know, Trevor, you yourself has experienced that sort of media framing you and any harms that you've caused. And so Alice, I was hoping that you could chime in a little bit about what folks are, how the media is looking at the governor's decision and sort of implementation of 1008 and any clemency opportunities that folks will have.
Yeah, well, I think what we've seen with the reporting on the governor's announcement about clemency really is kind of similar to what we usually see with reporting on serious crimes, which is that there's definitely a pattern there, right? It's we horrify people with the details of crimes, which are horrifying. I mean, it's not to say that they're not, but it's very much the surface level of here's the terrible thing that someone did. Here's the victim who was harmed. Isn't this terrible? Let's lock them away for as long as possible. I mean, that basically is what it comes down to. So when you get to the clemency reporting, what you see is the last time we heard about a lot of the people who may be going to benefit from clemency was when the media was reporting on their crime at the time that it happened or during the period when they were being tried or convicted of that crime. So you don't hear about what they have been doing in the 10, 15, 20 plus years since. You don't hear about how they have matured, how they have grown up. They've learned some life lessons. They've had some experiences. They've had some reflection on what they did, on who they were when they committed the crime. They've maybe gone through some programs. They've maybe had some opportunity to be with their peers and kind of learn together and find themselves after a period of time in a very different place than they were when they originally committed the crime. But we don't hear about that. We don't get media routinely reporting on how people are doing many years down the line. We just hear about what are often deemed by the media to be the key points: the time that the crime happens, the time that the person is prosecuted and convicted and sentenced, and then if there's any appeals, we may hear about those. And then finally, when there's a prospect of them being released, whether through clemency or because they finished the sentence, then we hear about them again. We often don't hear directly from the person. We tend to hear from the victims. Possibly we often will hear from the district attorney. We may hear from an attorney representing the person that's committed the crime, possibly if they have representation. But otherwise, what we've seen with this prospect of clemency for these youth is very similar to other crime reporting. There isn't a lot of depth there, and there isn't a lot of nuance, and there is very little reflection on both the person themselves at the heart of all of this, and also on systemic forces. You know, when do you see reporting on a crime that talks about systemic racism as well, and how that was a factor? When do you see reporting on a crime that talks about misogyny, transphobia, homophobia, you know, that talks about classism, that talks about different structures of power and privilege and how that came into play with what has happened here? You know, when do you see reporting on a crime that talks about neighborhoods that are over policed, you know, or that analyzes how it was that this person first came into contact with police, right, from those kind of perspectives? You just don't really see much of that in the day-to-day of local news reporting. It just is not really there a lot of the time. So what we've seen with the reporting on the clemency is very similar. It's we've seen some interviews with victims. We've seen district attorneys have certainly been in the media, generally speaking out against this. And you see highlights of cases that are, you know, some pretty shocking details, but not a lot of analysis of how we got here in the first place. I don't think I've seen a local TV news station do a story about why did we 25, 30 years ago make choices to put children in prison for these extraordinary lengths of time, and how are we now trying to address that? What the governor is ultimately doing? She's trying to use the powers that she has within the system to address mistakes made by people many years ago. There isn't a lot of that thought or analysis in there. So one of the things that we try to do as an organization is, one, get that kind of stuff out there, whether it's through traditional media, whether it's through social media, whether it's through things like this where we're talking about these issues. And we're trying to reach people, both because we're trying to do some public education, and that is an important component of what we do. We're doing the legal work, yes, but we're also trying to get the community on board with a different vision for how we address harm that happens within our communities. And we're also trying to show to whether it is people in prison or in jail now, or whether it's their family members out in the community, like there are people out there who are going to speak in the media for you, right? It's not trying to speak, you know, in somebody's place if they also want to have their voice, but it's trying to say like the district attorney perspective is not the only one out there, and it's not the only one that you should be hearing in the media. And there are people who are fighting for you, and there are people who are speaking for you. And that's something that we're trying to do as well, right? We know sometimes we hear from people who are in prison who are seeing the stuff that we're saying in the media, who write to us off the back of something they see in a newspaper or they see something on TV. So like it is reaching some people who need to hear that there are people out here that care about them, that are working for them, and that are trying to help. So that's another reason why we're trying to be a different voice in local media when we talk about this clemency, we talk about anything to do with the justice system, because people who are in the system, who are quite isolated, quite cut off from the rest of the community, need to know that there's people out here that are doing something to try to help.
So what has the response been that you've seen specifically to the governor, to her announcement that she was going to make this opportunities available for folks to get, you know, either a second look or an opportunity at clemency? What have you seen specifically about, I guess, maybe just how the governor's announcement's been taken, and what kind of response there's been towards her?
Well, I think some local media have really taken the district attorney's claims and run with them, some of which we definitely wouldn't agree to be true, such as the idea that the governor is making Senate Bill 1008 retroactive. She can't do that. She's not doing that. But often what we see here, and what we often will see, is that people like district attorneys will say whatever they want to say, and the media will eat that up and will present that as effectively as this is fact, right? You can trust this because this is coming from the district attorney. We have often said, like, they are the most powerful people in the justice system. They have control of so many levels of power, and they generally go pretty unquestioned, perhaps less so in the last few years, but they often have gone very unquestioned. And media still have a tremendous amount of deference to whatever district attorneys say and to whatever police say about crime. And this situation is no different. So criticism of the governor has often been voiced in the media by district attorneys, but it's often being presented by reporters in a way that does not question it at all. There is not really pushback. DAs will come out and say things, and that will just be taken as kind of absolute truth. And so the governor is being criticized for, it's being implied, kind of overstepping her authority, that she's going beyond what she reasonably should do. I mean, she clearly isn't. She has the power to do this, so she isn't overstepping her authority. But it's kind of an idea of, you know, the governor is interfering with the process, and it's somehow inappropriate for her to be doing this, that the sentences handed down many years ago, despite everything that we now know, and even knew then, but know even more now about, you know, youth brain development, or about systemic racism, or about the effectiveness or otherwise of long sentences of incarceration. There's still this idea of, well, however many years ago, a court said this was the sentence someone had to serve, so that's it. And I think what it speaks to is the lack of public understanding, and that people who work within the system, which also includes defense attorneys, have not done enough to kind of inform the community or empower the community with knowledge about how the legal system really works, and about how you know, all of these things like clemency are a factor, and victims are given to believe that when a sentence is handed down, that's it. You know, I've been told 20 years, I'm guaranteed 20 years till this person can be released. And there are so many ways that may not turn out to be the case. And so we're doing people a disservice when we have media giving very, very simplistic coverage of these cases that really doesn't have a lot of nuance, doesn't have a lot of depth. And so what the public then receives in their understanding of how the justice system works is often very far from the reality. and it's very simplified, and it's not helping people to understand what's really going on in our courts or in our prisons.
Yeah, well, and I think that, you did touch on this, that, we don't have a full understanding of how this sort of school to prison pipeline is impacting people. And, there was a time period when the media was covering that topic where it felt like that was something that was being talked about. But it feels like that's fallen away. And that's been my thought, that I haven't seen it as much. I don't know if you would agree with that. And I'd be interested too to see what you think about that, Dre, and if you think that there's been any media coverage, or having media coverage would be helpful with the situation that the Gresham students are facing, and just generally high school students are facing with school resource officers here in Oregon.
Yeah, I think media coverage is definitely important. I mean, as we see what's going on now, is a lot of false narratives actually present themselves, especially like with the gun violence that is spiked across the nation. Everything is being pushed and blamed on Black Lives Matter and defunding of the police, which COVID-19 has actually exacerbated a lot of the gun violence and the houselessness problems that we're seeing in our communities right now. So I think that media coverage is definitely important. I know that there's been a couple of media stations that has published stories from these actual students, with the officers actually in the article still calling them liars and stuff like that. So I think that to be able to balance out and have fair and accurate reporting, that you need to be able to hear both sides of it. And I think that that's super important to be able to get the narrative out.
I think in Portland too, we're lucky that we have some smaller papers that would sometimes do this kind of reporting, that we don't have to rely on the Oregonian as like the only potential news outlet to talk about these things. But, that has historically been, where people have gotten their news. So hopefully we have, we do have the opportunity to have more coverage. And I hope that does happen. And we don't have a ton of time left, and I was hoping that maybe you could, just say what, like, looking forward to the next year as we're closing out 2021, what do you see maybe as some hopeful points or some bright points, or things that you're hoping that will be changes that will happen for you in the district? And after that, I'm going to ask a similar question to other folks, so just so you can start thinking about that. But Dre, if you wouldn't mind going first.
Yeah, I've been talking with a lot of people. I think one thing that we're seeing right now because of media and because of social media is that we have one of the largest divides probably since the civil rights movement, that's occurring right now. And I think that having those conversations, those tough dialogue conversations with opposing sides, to be able to say why you are for or against something and really tell about your lived experiences is situations that I tend to put myself in, even if it's really uncomfortable. So I think that it's super important to have those conversations with the opposing side so that at least they can be able to get an understanding of it and it not be in an actual like heated atmosphere or environment where it's just argument going back and forth and debates going back and forth, but really diving into the tough dialogue conversations to really get an understanding. I think that the divide needs to end, or it can actually get worse. As far as in the district, we're hoping to continue to be part of the conversations. I think that it's super important to really listen to the youth and what they're wanting and expecting. I've also been seeing that a lot of the youth have been pushing for what Portland Public Schools are also pushing for, which is to get that extra day off. But then there's people that want to politicize the whole thing and say that that's not something good for the actual students when the students are also advocating for it. And I think that that's a problem that occurs is people want to politicize everything as far as like getting the school resource officer out, that it's all a political thing where our life isn't political. So we're going to continue to advocate in the meetings that are hosted. We're going to continue to push to make sure that the marginalized students and community members are actually heard. And, at this moment, we're fed up with status quo, and we're not going to continue to let status quo be something that is established and something that can continue to be much pushed forward, especially with false narratives in the media or with any type of police department.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much, Dre. And I hope that OJRC can be a part of that fight with you. So Gabe, I wanted to turn to you and see what your thoughts are. I mean, I know that OJRC has a lot on its plate right now, but if you could talk about what you see moving forward in 2022, and then there's sort of the subset of those that were not included in opportunities that the governor is currently given to those sentenced as youth, and just wondering if you have any thoughts or things you want to weigh in about that as well.
Yeah, definitely. And let me start by just acknowledging that our conversation today just sort of scratches the surface of all of the youth justice news that's going on in Oregon right now. And so before I share my own goals, I just wanted to briefly shout out some other state and local and national groups that I think are doing important work for young people. And one is Sunrise Movement has been doing really great climate organizing. They organized a really important youth climate strike in the fall, and right now they're advocating to stop freeway expansion. So I think that's a really important fight that they're working on. There's also a group called the Debt Collective that's organizing around canceling student debt, making free public education free. And you know, this is all related to the youth justice work. I mean, you think California public schools, for example, the UC system, everything used to be like very low cost and free and affordable. One of the reasons it got so expensive and that people now are saddled with so much debt is because Ronald Reagan, when he was governor, like wanted students to be in debt, so they were forced to work and they didn't have as much time to agitate and organize against the unfair systems they were facing. All these things are really interrelated, and so I think that call to cancel student debt is also a really important thing for people to pay attention to. But as far as sort of, you know, me personally, I think, you know, starting with what you mentioned, Amy, you know, the governor's clemency order that we were talking about earlier today, it extends to a lot of people who were left behind by these important legislative reforms, but it didn't apply to everyone. There are still some people left behind by that. And I think that, you know, if we're going to be serious about youth justice and, you know, what it means to treat people fairly in, you know, youth sentencing, we should be applying the same principles to everyone. You know, no child should be sentenced to die in prison, period. So I'd love to see the governor extend the relief she's extended to a lot of people to everyone and not exclude anyone from that. I'd love to see her and the legislature expand the principles of this recent legislation to people who are under 25, because the same science that applies to people under 18 extends to people as their brains are developing through their mid-20s. We touched on this, you know, through Dre's conversation, but I'd love to see police-free schools in Gresham and throughout the state. You know, we want to have counselors and psychologists in our schools and well-paid teachers. We don't want cops there. We don't want to see any kids prosecuted in adult criminal court. So if there are any prosecutors out there who want to be progressive, then stop prosecuting kids in adult court. So those are some of the things that I'm hoping to see in the new year.
That's awesome. And I'm so grateful that you joined the OJRC team. So thank you for moving out to Oregon to join this fight with all of us. And you've just been a huge asset to the organization. So, you know, I loved your call to action just now. It was great. So thank you for that. Trevor, looking towards the end of the year and into 2022, what are you seeing as some, I guess, goals or highlights, or however you'd like to frame it?
Yeah, I'm hopeful to successfully transition out of custody and back into communities and rejoin and be successful in doing so, based in part due to the governor's mercy and opportunity, right? I'm hoping to see, you know, those who haven't been invited, as Gabe alluded to also see the benefit of our governor's mercy. And I'm hopeful that the structure or the template that is being worked on, and I think we'll really see worked on a lot next year via this process, will be valued by our future elected officials in a way that helps promote as needed this kind of mercy being extended to people. I'm hopeful through continued public education and through individuals stepping out and being successful and being parts of communities will more holistically, whether we're sitting in the chair of a prosecutor or sitting in the chair of a defense attorney or a governor or anyone else along the way, will be closer to a place of not identifying an individual by the worst choice they ever made, and especially when that individual is a youth. And that we'll see kind of a completion to the fulfillment of the social contract and coming back fully, even extending to pardons where individuals are not restricted from different kinds of freedoms based on their history, and especially when that history was part of their juvenile, youthful choices, granted, but very young and immature and underdeveloped, and in a place of youth that lacks the recognition of the kind of the full extent of those choices, so that we can allow those people back into our communities in a more full way. So I'm hopeful of all those pieces and things that Gabe talked about, and that we can just provide, the needs that individuals have, regardless of what kind of place that comes from.
Thank you so much. That was also beautiful and really just inspirational. And I do hope that we can see that future together. Alice, do you have any sort of hopes for 2022 or anything else that you want to chime in on?
Well, I think the goal of our communications work continues to be really to speak truth to power, right? To try to be honest and accurate about what is happening within Oregon's legal system and within the prison system, and to help people, especially people who have been in the system, to share those stories, to help educate people, to help engage people, and turn people into supporters of change, right? To make people want to be activists, like Dre was talking about at the beginning, right? To get people to want to be activated so that they will do something to support change. One of the reasons why, despite all the many criticisms that you can have of social media, one of the reasons why I do love social media is because it has provided opportunity for people to be heard in a way that didn't happen when media was much more controlled, and where essentially only the voices selected were able to be heard on large public platforms. Now you see people exposing what is really happening in different situations. You see people who would not have been able to access that kind of platform previously being able to do so. So I think that the way that we can support those voices and amplify those voices and encourage those voices, the more that we can do of that, the better. And that's what we will be trying to do in 2022.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alice. I really appreciate that. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in today to learn more about the work of the Oregon Justice Resource Center, the problems facing youth more generally in Oregon, in their schools, and Oregon youth who are serving time. Thank you so much for joining us to Dre Miller, who's doing work, and you can follow his group. The group started by his children, Students Against Oppression. Follow, of course, Oregon Justice Resource Center on our social media, sign up for our email alerts. And again, if you value the work that we're doing here and you'd like to be a part of it, we would really appreciate your support. So consider making a year-end donation to support the Oregon Justice Resource Center. The Youth Justice Project is one of our projects, but we're doing many great things. So check out our website, OJRC.info, to learn more. So thank you, everyone. Take care. Have a great holiday season and a great end of 2021 and a beginning of 2022.